welcome to the show, man.
Glad to be here, Mike. Good to see you.
It's really good to see you. It's really good to see you. How's your family?
My family as well. Thank you. Especially in this time, with so many people dealing with the virus, we have been really fortunate so far to not have anybody contract the virus, and so we're, doing what we can to stay as safe as possible and prepare for the next transition, which is coming in September.
Right. As far as schools and stuff?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
my children and school, and so, and then myself I'll be teaching at the New England Conservatory and Manhattan School of Music, and just trying to get clarity on what that's going to look like, and making sure I'm staying safe and keeping my family safe and the students, all of that. So it's more complicated than it was.
Yeah. Just because I'm really curious, what it's so different for music students, and I'm trying to imagine what this fall is going to be like for them, because a lot of times you just hear in the news this school is going on a hybrid model, or that school is doing completely remote or distance learning. But as we all know, from like music students, how do you can't do ensemble playing remotely, right? You can do, maybe you can do lessons, but what are some of the things they're going to do?
Well, I think what I'm hearing is that there'll be some ensembles that are remote and some that are in person. And as you can imagine, I think the ones that are in person are where they have the space to accommodate the social distancing guidelines and to keep that, in play, to have the right space for folks to be able to play, safely.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so there will be folks playing in person at both schools. As I don't teach ensembles, I'm not totally in all the details, but I think, whereas usually there's a 2-hour ensemble, it's maybe going to be 1 hour, and then will happen, more frequently. I'm assuming it's going to be something like that, so that they can keep the airflow happening in the room and the fresh air. And then I think in terms of the hybrid of ensembles being online, that did start last semester, and I think, it's part of it can look like people recording and adding tracks, and like, bringing a song to its fruition, through everybody recording their own part, kind of a model. And I think it can also be, there's the latency is the biggest issue that people deal with in terms of playing together online. And I think there's a new an interface that somebody was talking about the other day that sounded like it was even quicker than Zoom. So that, I assume, is going to get better and better. But they've had some success with that. So I assume that might be something that folks use also to be able to play together remotely. So yeah, again, for both schools, for ensembles, it's going to be a combination of in-person and online.
Yeah, I think I know what you're talking about. I think Christian McBride did a highlight for that on his NPR show, and I don't remember the name of the technology, but I was listening to a story about that basically solves that issue, except it's limited by the distance.
Yeah, it's on my phone. It's something like Jack or something, But
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's good that more people are using it, because I don't know how else they would do it.
yeah, and I think the what you touch on is, this is a challenge for folks that are performance. That this is such a big part of how you develop as a young musician. That as a performer is playing with people and just logging hours. Learning how to interact, listen, adjust, all those things, and it's hard to replace that, because for example, if you're just laying down tracks, that is an art in and of itself, but you have more time to reflect and perfect your performance, whereas when you're in a room with folks, you're in the minute, having to adjust quickly, and that's an invaluable thing. And so that's even when you have an ensemble that's 2 hours, it's now going to be 1 hour, or 1 hour twice a week, for example. I think what's important is that the hours still get accrued if you can do that in a socially distant way, that's invaluable, I think, because again, for me, that's a big part of how you develop as a musician, is playing with people.
Yeah, my heart goes out to all these music students.
Yeah,
It's going to be tough.
it's tough. and there's two sides of it. I mean, on one hand, I feel like, you know, yeah, it's so tough to be having to struggle with this kind of issue right now. But on the other hand, this is a good time to be in school in a way, and not entering the workforce per se, but having, okay, I've got 4 years, or I've got 3 years, I've got, for an undergrad. And, for example, because I think at the end for those folks, the situation where, the infrastructure issues will be more sorted out 2 or 3 years from now than they will be in a year.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. It really, then it's a question of the people who've just graduated. It's a tough scene.
It is tough for all of them, absolutely. But I really feel for the folks who have just graduated, because it's just such a tough dynamic right now.
Yeah, yeah. All right. Well, good luck with all that. So yeah. So I'll just kind of date our conversation here. Today is Monday, and this past Friday you released a new track called Reckoning,
Yes.
and I hope people listening to this have had a chance to hear it. If they haven't, it's available on your favorite streaming service now. Definitely check it out. And I would love to have you talk a little bit about the track, Donny. Maybe to start with, where does the title come from? What does Reckoning mean?
Well, I was thinking a lot about the situation we're in, and just the well, the racial inequality, in our country, and it's got to change. And I feel, and so the title Reckoning really came from the idea that, where a true reckoning has to happen in terms of the history of, race in our country, and the ways that folks are marginalized, that are not even on the surface and overt, but more like institutional, and it's complex, and I don't feel like I understand it all, but I feel like there has to be a true reckoning for us to really move forward in a way that feels like it's a more of a level playing field, and it just hasn't been that way for so long. And again, I don't fully understand it, especially coming from my own, being a white person, and having privilege in ways that I don't even fully understand, or I'm coming to terms, or I'm starting to come to terms with it in ways that I didn't understand until, these last months with everything that's happened. And so part of it is me reckoning with my own, inherent privilege that I was born into. And then, really wanting there to be a larger reckoning with just all the ways, that the insidious ways that this stuff manifests itself, and wanting there to be change, that, and it's so complex, and I know it's not having one person in a position, it's having a lot of really smart people who know how to deal with this stuff, and who have a like mind to really honestly look at this, and to try to deal with it. Because it's just, you look at the statistics, and for, as one, way of looking at this, not even emotionally, which is more how I process these things, but you look at the statistics, and it's just not right, so that's some of what that title means for me. And this is the inspiration behind the piece. I was just feeling emotional about it, angry, and started working on it, and kept that sort of at the forefront of the creative process. And I partnered with Ben Rubin on this track, and we were of like minds on this, and we talked about this through the process, and some of the samples that you hear on the track are samples of that Ben grabbed from the news, from protests. One in particular, there's an African American officer yelling at another officer, a white officer, to stop, the excessive force he was using on a situation where it was unwarranted. So that's kind of an overview of where the title comes from.
Yeah, thank you for that. So can I ask you this? Is it safe to say that in a way this is a certainly this is your artistic reaction to this horrible or these horrible situations, the George Floyd killing and countless others. Is it part reaction, but also maybe part, I don't know if it's the right word to use, but in a way, like honoring their memory in a way? Have you thought about it that way? Is
I
that,
thought of it as you know, the parts, the anger is anger that it feels like we live in a racist country still. A
sure,
racist whole lot
absolutely.
pervasive, and
Hmm.
around that, then I think there's a feeling of hope, you know, in the song, and that's hope of the inspiration of seeing all the protests, and you know, and that there's so many young people that are involved, that there are people across the demographic spectrum involved, and that I still have hope that we can move beyond this. And that might sound very, very idealistic, you know, because I know it's real hard in ways that I can't imagine to root this out. But that's the duality that I see.
Yeah, I've been thinking about just the context of this track and sort of the bigger picture for you as a jazz musician, as a white jazz musician, and and just some of my own humble experience, real briefly after college, and also as a music student. One of the things I personally always appreciated about being a jazz musician is, or was when I was performing, I was always sharing the bandstand with people of the opposite color, you know, always. Or some of my best memories, I was the only white person. And in particular, my parents used to live in Chicago when I was in college. I would come home from breaks and I had the opportunity to go to some of the jam sessions that were happening. This would have been around 2002, 3, 4 in those years. And there was two in particular. And they were both in the south side of Chicago. And one was Von Freeman, the Von Freeman New Apartment Lounge,
Yeah.
the late great Chicago saxophonist. And then there was another one called the Velvet Lounge.
Right.
And it was, you know, very often I wouldn't just be the only white person on the bandstand. I would probably be the only white person at the bar at the club,
Mm-hmm.
and I was always welcomed, like completely welcomed. I never once was made to feel like I didn't belong there, and that really hit me hard. That memory really hit me hard when these recent horrible killings happened because it made me think about white privilege. It made me think about my own experience with the Black community, and it's always been with open arms. And why is it so horrible the other way, you know? And
Yeah.
it's just it's equally infuriating and just heartbreaking that unfortunately a lot of the country still feels that way towards the Black community. It's just I think one of the things that I struggle with too is okay, like yes, I absolutely want change, and then the question kind of becomes like, what can I do, you know?
Yeah.
And so when I'm so glad you put this track out because I think at the very least it's going to raise more awareness and conversation, and maybe in our own, you know, small corner of the universe within the arts, maybe there's a lot we can do to level the playing field. I know on my side of the table, certainly, you know, on the business side of things, it's sad, but people of color are in the minority in some of these higher up positions I've seen, right? Whether you're talking about promoters or even agents or whatever. So that begs the question: what are the hiring policies for all of that? You know, so I guess this is a long-winded way of saying your track alone, I think, hopefully would spark more conversation to create more equality in our industry.
Mm. Well, I would like to be part of the solution instead of part of the problem. To sort of echo this Joe Henderson, there was a Joe Henderson song years ago. If you're not, I think it's if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. And you know, I feel like I also want to do whatever is I have means to do to be an agent of change, and you know, because it's just, you know, it's just so heartbreaking, and it's so infuriating, and just totally unfair, and it's so pervasive, and it's got to stop, you
Yeah,
know. So, I need to also educate myself more about, well, what are the, you know, where should I be giving, you know, when I have the ability to, you know, is it the ACLU, is it the, you know, and I need to do work on all of that, and just try to find ways to do the right thing.
Right, right. I guess just one other point about this track for you as a jazz musician. It just goes without saying, right? Jazz is originally America's true original Black art form,
Mm.
right?
Mm.
And so for you as a white musician, a white jazz musician, to have developed this track within that historical context, I think also says a lot about this music and the power that it has to sort of bridge, bridge the divide, if you will, right?
Yeah.
You know,
I it's I was talking about this the other day. I've spent my whole life really idolizing so many African American artists.
totally.
I mean, we could just sit here and talk for hours about the incredible depths of beauty they have brought to our society. With this gift of art, and so um, I just so grateful to all those musicians, and then of course thinking about how the obstacles that they had to overcome in their own period dealing with racism. It's a long list of Thelonious Monk, Duke Ellington. I mean, there's just so much to talk about there, but it's incredible that so many artists were able to endure that kind of abuse and still express themselves through this art form, and it's incredible. It's an incredible art form, and I'm just grateful to be a part of it, and to have been able to be exposed to this music as a young kid, and have these incredible experiences, listening and interacting with musicians that African American musicians who have lived a life that I can't even totally fully understand in some ways.
Right.
They had to go through.
Right. I think just thinking about my own perspective too, which is hopefully my eyes have been really opened, like in a big way about all of this, and just that we still have such a long way to go. But just to relate it back to what you were just talking about, some of the great African American artists who have had to endure. I was recently rereading Miles Davis's autobiography, and there's a part in it where he talks about the first time he went to Europe, and it might have been France or Paris or whatever, and how he was treated for the first time in his life with respect and recognition as an amazing artist, and all these things which he had never experienced in his own country, right? And that's just one example of a long line of history of Black artists who have had to deal with that. And it's, yeah, I mean, it just, like you said at the beginning, like for us as white people, it is something that we don't really, we can't really understand, right? And so I think to acknowledge it is of course an important first step, but and just realizing too how much further there is to go, for sure.
Yeah, and what can we do, to make that change happen? I mean, it's hard to imagine what that kind of exclusion, what racism, or how that affects your psyche when it's constant, when it's all these subtle ways that we can't can't even really appreciate because we've never had to walk in those shoes. And
Right.
I mean, I had a memory one time I was in Poland, and I was with a couple of friends of mine in the band who were African American. We were walking down the street, and people were just like staring at us, and it wasn't at me, it was, and I remember saying like, man, is this happening to you guys all the time? Like, yeah, and that, it's not like people were staring, giving us dirty looks or anything, but I just, that's just such a small example of something that, how does that affect somebody's psyche and a community psyche when that's happening all the time in all these different ways?
Right.
And I don't answer, but necessarily, but that, I just feel like we all have to do our part, to make this change.
Yeah. So the track has only been out for a few days. I'm curious, what has the reaction been like thus far? Have you?
I'm not somebody, I haven't been I'm not checking my social media or comments necessarily to see. Uh, but people have reached out to me, and it's been overwhelmingly positive so far.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I'm glad to hear that. Yeah, I'm really glad to hear that. Well, I've got some other questions for you to maybe go in a different direction. Is there anything else about Reckoning we didn't cover that would be worth mentioning to people who are listening?
Um, well, I mean, it's something that was developed in quarantine, and written, since the pandemic has taken hold. So um, it was something where I was tracking in a closet initially in my phone, and working with Ben Rubin, who I mentioned earlier, who was in Brooklyn, and sending files back and forth. So one thing that's different about this than the other music I've recorded over the years is that this is just really just the two of us, and Ben used the 808 to create the drum beat and was very inspired by DJ Premier, and the piano stuff and the bass stuff were all things that I sequenced, that Ben fleshed out into a fuller sound, and he manipulated the sound, so it was a real different process. And eventually I did go into a recording studio to record the lead sax with a different, with a little bit more of a sort of, a little more of a professional setup or whatever. But, because instead of my phone, we were recording in a, proper mic and preamp and all. But it was obviously a different way to create a track with everything that's happening, but really rewarding, and Ben did a great job, and we just had this sort of a constant back and forth about how the track was developing.
Yeah, sounds great. Well, that's a good segue to some of the things I was going to ask you about your experience during quarantine and the pandemic in general.
Mm.
And I don't have to tell you how drastically it's changed our industry. But maybe to start, what has surprised you most about how you've handled the pandemic, both professionally and personally?
Well, I would say that hmm, I would say that what has surprised me the most about how I've handled it, um, I think the initial when it initially started happening, um, I was very focused on what I wanted to get accomplished artistically, and that was a lot of composition. Reckoning being one of these things that came, although not at the very beginning. I had some other things I was working on writing, and that lasted for a lot longer than I had anticipated. So that was a surprise. I thought, oh, maybe this will roll for a week or two, and then I'll be suddenly feeling lost and trying to find my way. But that lasted for a couple months, roughly, where I felt pretty focused, and felt like I was making progress on the composition front, especially. Um, and then I think once that ran its course, it got back into that dynamic where, struggling for focus, then you have focus, and, what am I working on? And there's, on one hand, there's composition, and on the other hand is working on the instrument. And how do I keep both of those things happening, and stay inspired and all that? So, but in terms of the most surprising thing, I would say, was the long duration that I had that did feel focused at the outset. And I, looking back on it, I think it's because the last, 3-4 years I feel like I've been going nonstop in one fashion or the other. It's been kind of one thing to the next, and a lot of great things. But I have had this feeling of, man, I wish I had more time to write. And then suddenly I got it, within the context of living a family life, and having my children and overseeing their education online. And, there's a lot of, it wasn't just that I suddenly had 24 hours a day to write. I have a lot of other things going on, but I suddenly had a lot more, but I suddenly actually did have more time to write. And so that I was grateful for that, period. And, since then, there's sort of been ups and downs, but I think Reckoning was a real point of focus um, once that materialized and we started making headway on that. And then I have various other songs that are in different stages of development, all that have been happening over the last few months. A couple mixes got finished of songs that I've been working on for the last year, and then there's newer songs that are in their demo phase, and some that are in the middle. So this whole while just trying to keep that progress happening, and that has been moving forward. So making the best of it. It's obviously a hard situation. It's a hard situation. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, nobody knows when it'll be over, so to speak, but I think the thing that a lot of people are wondering is, what will things be like when we can all be together again, right? And we know it'll be different, but I mean, I guess I'm curious to hear from you, just again, thinking about the last 4 or 5 months, once we get the all clear, whenever we do, what are some things that are going to be really important to you that you bring forward with you into that? And then conversely, what'll be important that you don't bring with you? Like, is there anything that you're like, okay, I'm done with that and I'm not, I'm clear about that?
Right. Well, I guess, I think like so many people, I will feel really happy to be able to be in front of an audience and play music, and I think programming wise, I've had more time to reflect on what my shows looked like the last few years. And again, things were happening so quickly, I maybe wasn't always able to be quite as thoughtful, perhaps, or reflect. I wasn't able to reflect a lot because things were just constantly happening. So I think I've had more time to reflect now. So I think that'll show. That's something I can bring to when live performances start again. Really thinking after having reflected on what's happened. What do I want to change about the presentation?
Can I interrupt? Can I ask, like, what might be an example of that you would change?
Well, I think sometimes with the larger group I have with singing and guitar and keyboards, and it tends to be loud and it tends to be intense, and that's a reflection of the music. But I think with this period that we're living through, the music that's going to come out of this is going to be a little different, and I think that will be an element. But I think, for example, there might be, some much more, thematic, lyrical pieces that emerge in the music that I start to present after this, as it might be a reflection of what's been happening. So I see that as something that can change, the way that I present music, and also, my love of acoustic music. I haven't been doing much of that the last 4 or 5 years, and had actually done a tour right before the lockdown started happening. That was with Trio. That was so much fun. So I think there could be some more acoustic manifestations of my artistic thing could happen within these sets that are electronic or acoustic things happening in and of themselves. So I just think more. Pacing, what am I trying to say here? I think more thoughtful pacing will happen.
Of the actual set of music, or?
Yeah, and well, it's kind of a reflection of the new music that I'm writing, which has that aspect. Not so much Reckoning, of course. Other stuff based on what I've been listening to and inspired by.
Okay, that's interesting. So, yeah, you alluded to having kind of gone through a lot of writing. Well, actually, you flat out said that at the beginning of this lockdown, you were sort of in a prolific stage of writing. Does that mean, for your fans who are listening, do you have plans to put out a full album in the next 12 to 18 months? Do you see yourself putting out a couple tracks periodically? What are you thinking about that?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure on what the format is going to be. It could be a full-length album. It could be a couple tracks. It could be an EP. It could be all of that. I think it'll depend on how these things end up when they get to the end, when they get to the finish line. And and part of it is this reckoning being the exclusion, since that's something that is done now and out, but all this other music hasn't been recorded yet. So I'm actually thinking now about how to record it in a way that makes sense. And so I think once all that stuff is further along, I'll be ready to put something out. So the short answer is yes, there will be new music in the next year, year and a half, or sooner. The question is what format, how's it going to look? And I'm just not clear yet, but I'm not really concerned so much about that right now, because I'm more concerned with like finishing the songs.
Definitely. Well, I mean, for what it's worth too, like I wouldn't, if there was some way I could have heard Reckoning and not known it was during this time in history where you had to be isolated to produce it and record it and everything, I wouldn't have known you were isolated. Like there's no, aside from the fact that you're doing some things on it that I haven't really heard you do before, I would not have known this was a completely, like you were talking about having to sequence things in the closet. Like I wouldn't have known any of that. So I don't know if I have a question from this other than just, an observation, which is like, one thing that a lot of people ask me, just friends that ask me who are not in the music industry, everybody seems to comment, oh, well, I bet this is a really creative period for artists, is what I keep hearing. And that is certainly true. Like you're seeing a lot of artists do things because of the circumstances that they might not have done.
Mm.
So again, I don't know if I have a specific question from that other than just thinking, I really like what you came up with for Reckoning. I like that it's really, I mean, understandably from the context, it's very edgy. It's a statement, totally. But yeah, I suppose if there's a question from that, then maybe it's how would that experience inform your recording process going forward, knowing that you can produce something so artistically powerful in very unconventional circumstances.
Well, thanks. And I appreciate that. And I think there's two things that come to mind. And one is that, it's kind of liberating in a way to have this play out this way and to feel like the final song doesn't necessarily sound like it's something that was, done under restriction of one sort or the other. So for that's exciting, because it means I could do more of this, and it's a leaner way to produce music, leaner but way to produce music. So that's something I certainly think about. But I'd also say, I've heard that too, this is such a prolific time for artists, and I think that's true, but I think it's also balanced with, but it's also a really challenging time, because artists, musicians, composers, these people are dealing in the emotional world, and a lot of us dealing with, touring as their main source of income. I mean, so I think on one hand, yes, there's all this time to compose, but there's the other side of like, but what is happening to the industry, and how are people going to make a living? How are people going to survive between now and 12 or 18 months from now? And that's tough. And so what's the sort of mental health side of it? And I think that's got to be a challenge. I think for most folks I talk to, it's not like a straight line of like, yeah, I'm doing great, I have all this time to write, I've written this. I mean, I know that's happening, but at the same time, I think it's also, there's a real struggle with people who are trying to survive,
100%. Yeah.
And that's not to be taken lightly, considering how so many musicians and stuff live, month to month or whatever is maybe, but you know what I mean by that. Like so many of us live like we're,
Well, it's kind of gig to gig.
Right? So suddenly the gigs are gone, and then there's unemployment, but then the federal situation is, so I think it's also like, man, how's everybody going to deal with this, survive this economically and spiritually, mental health wise, kind of navigate through this tricky period.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and also it's worth mentioning too that on the one hand, like you've put out this incredibly powerful and great track, but just for people who aren't aware, who maybe have forgotten, you're not going to see much money from it through Spotify, and that's the main source of opportunity for people to listen to it. So I think about that a lot too. And that was true way before the pandemic. I mean, that's been true for 10 years or more.
Right.
So, you know, that's something I think a lot about too, is like when you personally, whether it's one track or a full album, invest so much time and energy and money into this, you know, into your craft, into this final product, if you will, but knowing that, you know, you're not going to see much by way of royalties from it. You're going to make money from touring and selling CDs at the show, which of course you can't do now. So that has to make it hard too.
That's part of that, you know, the difficult dynamic that we're in right now. Yeah.
Right. Right. Yeah, and I don't think most people really make that connection. You know.
Right.
You know, the casual fan. I mean, I don't know if they are really aware of that. You know, that for the vast majority of artists, they will not see much by way of income from streaming. They just won't.
Right.
So yeah, I think it's worth mentioning for sure.
Mm.
Yeah. Well, before we started recording, I asked if it would be okay for me to ask you a David Bowie question, and you kindly said, yeah, of course. So, you know, people can read all the interviews you've done over the past 3 or more years about your experience with Bowie. So my question, and maybe you have been asked it before, but it's something I'm really curious to hear from you is, you know, you've had the great fortune in your career to work with a lot of amazing artists. And of course, Bowie is a standout one. So if you had to kind of boil it all down to a couple of fine bullet points, what was it about him that made him so different from all the others in the studio or when you were working with him? What was so different?
Well, I think part of it was his total commitment to realizing his artistic vision without compromise. And letting
what do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, letting the music be what it was without trying to over control it. Like surrounding himself with people that he trusted and letting them do what they do without micromanaging it, you know, and just letting it, you know, kind of happen within this framework that he created, and articulating to people that he essentially wanted them to feel free to try whatever they wanted to try, and so I think it was that ability to, you know, recognizing people who he felt like could realize what he had in mind, and then also letting him, you know, giving them the freedom to do it within this framework that he set of these great songs. So to me, that's, you know, I've seen that, of course, and experienced that, and have tried to live that my own prior to working with him. But there was something really powerful about that experience with him, and his leadership in that sense, and his trust. You know, it was beautiful, and I think also just his authenticity, you know, and his when we were together, totally present in the moment, and engaged in everything that was happening, and in a way that was peaceful. The word peaceful comes to mind. You know, he was engaged, but not, but it was very authentic. That's what it is. Authentic engagement in the moment, and I really appreciated that. And again, something that I've striven for, but seeing him live that out when we worked together, when we were in the studio, was really inspiring.
Would you say any of that influenced the way you approached Reckoning or some of your most recent material? But I'm just using Reckoning as an example.
Absolutely. I mean, I do feel that it reinforced those values, you know, that in a big way that I've had, and so it did, and I guess, you know, I'm not thinking so much about genre, you know, I'm just thinking about where is the music leading me, what, you know, where am I feeling led by the music, and reckoning is an example of that, you know, where I'm not thinking of it in terms of so much in terms of genre or this or that. It's just like, this is the music, this is the statement, and working and working and working and working and working at it until it feels like it's gotten to that place where you feel like it's representing what you're trying to say. And I feel like that's something that he, again, exemplified. You know, when we were recording, my understanding was, you know, he was after the studio, he would sometimes go and work on Lazarus, the off-Broadway play, and then at night we'd be back at his place, and he was listening to what we'd recorded, and then we come in the next morning and start again. So he was, you know, he was working at it, and totally engaged in the creative process, which I appreciate, and that's you know, something that I try to live.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that.
Sure.
It's really great to hear. Well, what else? You have talked a little bit about some of the other things you're working on. I mean, I was going to kind of close our conversation by just having you maybe talk about some of the things that are coming down the pipeline, but you kind of already did that. Is there anything else we should cover?
I don't know. Nothing really comes to mind. I mean, I'm just, you know, one thing that's been um, that I've appreciated about having more time is having more time to listen to music. And for years, I felt like I just didn't have enough time to really delve into records as much as I wanted to. But I've been doing that and listening to a lot of great music, which has been inspiring. And
Who are some of the people you've been listening to?
oh, it's just all over the place, all over the spectrum. Um, Yesterday, I was listening to a new David Benny Kenny Wollesen duo record called Basu that just came out. That sounds great. Genevieve Artadi's new record, listening to the other day.
Yeah, I was listening to that too, actually.
And Luciana Souza's new record with Vince Mendoza and the WDR band. It's killing. So great. I was listening a little bit to Maria Schneider's new record, which is killing. Data Lords.
Yeah.
Some of that. You know,
Your playing on that is pretty great too.
oh, thank you, man. Thanks. Uh, uh, yeah, and a chance in that case, you know, it's a chance for me to sit back and listen to the music as a listener, you know, instead of being in the bandstand in the sax section or whatever, you know, a chance to just hear the overall thing, you know, which is really fun to do. What else have I been listening to? Those are the top sort of 5 things the last few days. And that, yeah, I'm just continuing to work on new music, and excited about where it's leading.
Awesome, awesome. Well, Donny, thank you so much for your time today and for talking to me. And you know, again, just want everybody who's listening to this to check out the track Reckoning. Really, really powerful artistic statement from you, and thank you for making it.
My pleasure. Thank you so much, Mike.
All right, take care, say hi to the family, and I hope I can see you soon.
Absolutely.